Welcome to the Big Rethink Interviews. I'm Bryan Alexander. I'm the host for the interviews. And with me today is Ed Ayers, Professor of History. And well, what is your current title right now?
It's got a lot of words. I'm the Tucker-Boatwright Professor of the Humanities and President Emeritus at the University of Richmond.
Fantastic, fantastic. It's a delight to see you again.
Thanks.
And to hear from you. We have a whole series of questions, so let me just dive into them. They start with a kind of large scale, then they get even larger, and then they zoom in a bit.
Okay.
So the first one is, when you look at higher education right now, how is it responding to the dual challenges of COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter? And how are you seeing the landscape shift or adjust?
Well, it's responding the way that it has responded to everything, which is in a highly patchwork manner. You know, the strength and weakness of American higher education is that it's not really a thing. It's a series of parallel processing that's going on. And there's over 4,000 institutions. And so I was Dean of Arts and Sciences at the University of Virginia, then became president at Richmond. And so before I was AAU with all the deans and seeing, what graduate programs and, a research university looks like. And then suddenly became associated with what are called private liberal arts colleges, even though I always insist on calling them nonprofit. They're 501c3s, they're not a country club, right? Even though that's a part of the stigma that gets attached to them. In which case I was working with lots of other small liberal arts colleges and getting to know their presidents. And then I was also on the board of the American Council of Education, in which case we have everybody from community colleges to the Ivy League. Sure. And so I was really struck, having spent the first part of my career for 27 years at Virginia. I've not gone anywhere else. I didn't see the incredible landscape of American higher education. And I became struck that all these institutions are on entirely different vectors with different kinds of concerns and different kinds of strategies for adaptation. And then, of course, even within these different segments, if you have money or not, makes enormous difference, right? So, and those don't always map onto the same way. There's a lot of liberal arts colleges on a per capita basis, including Richmond, that are actually fortunate. And there are a lot of big, famous public universities that are highly vulnerable because of the state support. So when I was Dean of Arts and Sciences, over 90% of my funding came from the state of Virginia. And so I became Dean 3 weeks before 9/11. And then the bottom dropped out of the funding. I had to give back $5 million. And I had to go to my first faculty meeting as Dean and cancel all 27 searches and take away all faculty travel for 2 years. Oh, man. So now I'd been there for 20 years as a faculty member. People knew me, and I hadn't really sought the job, but I took it as a sort of like, service, and I was, happy to do it. But, as you can imagine, that was remarkably hard. And after I did it, the executive vice president of the university said, it just saved you from layoffs. So, I'm like a really, cheerful guy that's not much into hard economic decisions. But if you have to do these things to save the enterprise, yes, and for the greater good, it turns out you can, and that people get it. So the point being, people would think of the University of Virginia as a wealthy institution with a large endowment and public support, but how vulnerable it is really remarkable. So how are institutions doing? We don't know yet, right? I mean, the real test hasn't come. And so what we do know is that we're all more fragile than we appear. When you see Princeton and Harvard teaching only half their students, it gives you some sense of how fragile it is. So I think that I've been struck by the creativity and the goodwill. One thing about being a faculty member for 20 years with no administrative experience, suddenly to be in charge of 12,000 undergraduates and several thousand graduate students and faculty, is the amount of talent in the administrative ranks. I hate that phrase even, administrator, right? The people who make the place run. And I'd have to say, I was struck by how selfless people there are, the people who are overseeing spreadsheets and things, how hard they work. So I'm confident that the intrinsic qualities of these institutions will allow them to adapt as well as they possibly can. Ironically, faculty are adapting in their own ways, but often are on sort of a different vector than the people who are overseeing the university as a whole. So on the coronavirus and the financial crisis that's going to come, and one thing about being a president, I spent a lot of my energy in student recruitment. I spent a lot of my energy in raising money. I spend a lot of my time thinking about athletics. And you can see that all of those things are different problems to be solved. And so I think that as those of us who care about higher education think about all this, I'd say cut everybody some slack, because I think everybody is doing what they can. But what does it mean to have to recruit an international student body when things have changed this? And so we pride ourselves, Richmond, we have one of the most international student bodies of any liberal arts college. You have to go all around the world every year to recruit these students. What do you do when the very thing you prided yourself on becomes a vulnerability, right? That's the sort of thing. So that's, I guess I could have given the short answer, but I didn't. And I'm not even finished with the second part of the answer. But the strange things is things that had seemed to be strengths for so long suddenly become vulnerabilities. The residential model, the small class sizes, the in-person, all those things. So it's kind of turned higher education wrong side out on the coronavirus part. I will come up for air for a moment to see if you'd like to explore any of that before I talk about the Black Lives Matter aspect of things.
These are all good, and these also tie into some of the questions to come. So why don't you charge ahead with Black Lives Matter?
Now, so on that front, I'm a historian of the American South, and therefore I've written a lot about race in America, and I've written several books actually about the American Civil War, and I live in Richmond and in Charlottesville. So as you can imagine, and I'm on several commissions to figure out about the statues on Monument Avenue. I'm on a point about the governor to think about, do we replace Robert E. Lee in the U.S. Capitol for the state of Virginia? So I've been living all of this on a day-to-day basis really for a decade and thinking about it. And it's remarkable. I mean, I think here's a case where our higher education has been way ahead of the curve. We've been thinking about white supremacy and the structures of systemic racism and what symbols mean and all these things longer than the larger population. I mean, it's been, and the issues of Confederate memory of statues, it's been sort of an industry for the last 20 years to thinking about where does this iconography come from. And suddenly it's being pulled down. Suddenly it's a political issue. So I think that universities are simultaneously well-positioned as thought leaders and vulnerable as institutional places, because so many of us have named parts of ourselves for people who are deeply implicated in systemic racism. And our students are impatient. They can't understand why we would dally to make any changes that need to be changed. And so being at the University of Virginia, which is basically built by enslaved people, it was mainly after I left that the university mobilized itself to put the memorial to the working people who built the institution and so forth. But you can imagine that you have generations of injustice. There's a lot to atone for and to account for. So in both these cases, strengths and weaknesses are so closely linked in higher education that it's going to be interesting to think about.
It's quite a theme. Universities as thought leaders, but also having so many deep interwoven connections to structural racism. And to have students and drawing on both of those as a kind of Venn diagram, really overlapping both.
Yeah, and I think that, so at the University of Richmond, we're wrestling with some of this, and I met with this alumni association about the naming of a building. And they were very understanding. And I said, they said, where did this come from? And I said, these students are doing what they're supposed to do. They're 19, they're looking around. How is the institution of which I'm currently a part reckoning with this big change? And I'm finding that generally alums go, yep, I understand that. We need to think, even though this never occurred to us at the time. And I love that building with that name on it, right? You know, I have that association. I understand why these are doing. So it's, as we think about all these cross-cutting patterns, generation is one of them. And obviously ethnic background is another as well. So the good news is that it makes for a very interesting class and for a YouTube series.
Well, it does make for a very, very chewable topic with a great deal of content, a great deal of directions to head, but it's also in terms of administration, that's a very, very difficult one to work with. Well, these are, if you'll forgive me, these are qualitative observations. These are let me switch gears a little bit and ask, you know, as you analyze these changes, as you look at these struggles, what kind of metrics do you measure? What kind of trends do you keep an eye on, or would you recommend that we keep an eye on?
You know, I think that was one of the big discoveries I made when I became dean, is how much of the job depends on the math. You know, as a historian, and I've done statistical stuff in the past, but it turns out that if you need to offer enough Spanish classes, and a young person's entire college career depends on whether or not you can generate enough sections of that, it turns out that that's a database problem. And then if you are trying to, as we did, I'm proud to say, more than double students of color at Richmond, how do you do that? Well, it's econometric modeling and shoe leather, right? Is how you do it. And so I think our institutions are well equipped in terms of expertise in dealing with large amounts of data. The thing is that most of our patterns change slowly in higher education. We're not used to a seismic rupture in, you know, either the amount of funding or the number of residence rooms. You know, there's a long tail of data that allows us to predict. And I explained to my trustees at Richmond, say, let's imagine we have over 12,000 applicants. You get down to 3,000 people that you would admit, then you need to get down to 800 people who will come. And at every step, you're competing with an infinite number of other institutions and options and opportunities, and they're 18 years old. And some people you are charging a lot of money, and other people you are giving a remarkably valuable education. And trying to combine all those variables is remarkably hard. So how's higher education doing on that? I think that one of our, let's go to the second issue first and think about how we're doing on ethnic diversity.
Hang on one second. Let me pause you just for a second. I wanted to welcome a student in the LDT program, the awesome Kelly Harris. Kelly, hello. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Good. Good. My apologies. Kelly was hoping to join us, and I very carefully gave her the wrong URL. But she persisted, and we got the right URL.
Well, I just assumed that her smiling face was welcome in the conversation since she appeared here, and I just tried to keep on rolling, assumed that you would introduce her as the opportunity presented itself.
I apologize for just popping in the middle of one of your answers.
Fantastic. You're fantastic.
Not a problem.
We're on the metrics question right now.
Yes.
And please go ahead.
So if we think about pull the camera back on the larger issues of diversity in American higher education, and let's compare us to 1970. Let's think about gender first. The number of women who have come to higher education is, I don't want to throw around percentages and numbers that I'm not really completely on top of right now, but it's been an astronomical increase. And so at which point women are now a majority of the students, right? It's also the case that in terms of sheer numbers, members of various ethnicities have seen their college attendance double. But if you turn it upside down and say, what percentage of our students are of different ethnicities and what are their odds of graduation, then we're failing, right? So again, I can't think of any metaphor for all these things except sort of cross-cutting vectors, like these lasers that are going in different directions. Because on one hand, we've lived through the great democratization of American higher education since 1965. And the sheer scale of what we've done has grown so enormously. On the other hand, when I was in college in the very early 1970s, that was a larger percentage of students, maybe partly because of the Vietnam War, were going to college, and then it's declined. And so, but it's mounting. So on one hand, we're creating more opportunity than we've ever created before. The Pell Grants, the amount of financial aid that each institution is generating is enormous. The efforts to increase socioeconomic diversity, all those are remarkable. On the other hand, the threshold of cost complicates matters so much. So even though my institution, when I was president, we were spending $70 million a year on financial aid, an enormous amount, the reputation was that we cost a lot of money and you couldn't afford to go there, right? And so we try to explain to people it only costs that much if you can afford it. And if you can't, we'll make it. But that's a hard formula to explain to people as you're trying to recruit people. I used to get in trouble with my friends in admissions because I pointed out my father was a used car salesman. And I was explaining to him the model of what we're doing, which the sticker price basically doesn't mean anything. And he says, son, that's a bad business model. And so there's something to it. And we actually use the phrase sticker price, right? Just like a car. And so we've gotten ourselves in a position through high aid, high tuition, that for many institutions and for many families, it works very well. But on the other hand, when I went to college at the University of Tennessee, it's $124 a quarter. And so my family didn't have much money, but it didn't require much in order for me to get a college degree, right? And so we've gotten ourselves in a position where higher education costs what it does because it provides so many more services than it did before. It's not just escalation, it's not irrational. And I mean, I know when I was a college student, here's class, here's a dorm. Good luck, right? And today, the number of activities and psychologists and medical attention and all the club sports and all those things have cost a lot more. So we've gotten ourselves in a position where we're offering a very expensive service, and it's not exactly clear how we sustain the funding for it. And one bad byproduct of that is it's very hard to explain to first-generation families how they can afford it. It just doesn't seem to make sense to people. And the other thing is, how do you explain to full-pay families that the person that their son or daughter is sharing the room with, the suite with, might not be paying anything for something that you're paying $250,000 a year for? So it depends on, all these things have been made for good reasons. I don't think anybody would design this system from the ground up.
Well said. So tuition discounting is definitely one of these stats we have to follow. The gap between the full pay families and the rest is something that I've been tracking. I'd be happy to ask you more about that at another time. But this does lead to our next question actually pretty smoothly. We wanted to look ahead a bit beyond the next academic and fiscal year. And
please.
That's right. Take my semester, please. Right. But we wonder what are some of the longer term changes that you anticipate for higher education? I know as a historian, I know counterfactuals are often scary things, and the future is something that just try to avoid. But I'm wondering, as a recovering administrator, what what kind of flexes, what kind of transformations do you think we should anticipate?
Well, I think that, again, historians love to pull the camera back. We pull it back far. We've seen this great revolution in democratization, but that revolution was begun by public investment, which is now pulled away. So in some ways, we had a scaffolding of enormous public investment that allowed us to build these large, complex institutions that perform all these functions that are essential to so many communities, and that are, in fact, never more valuable in terms of individual advancement. I mean, a college education is worth more than it's ever been worth before as a differential over people who don't have a college education, right? So that's what's scary, is that we build, especially through our great public systems, these enormous capacities, but then we keep each year pulling the ladder away a little bit farther. So you just wonder how long until can that stand without that support. At the same time, the excellent nonprofit liberal arts colleges, I think the rich get richer. If you have the capacity to offer all of these things, a remarkably rich experience with no TAs, class size of 14, I think most faculty would agree that's better if you can do it, right? It's better than lecturing to 800 people and so forth. But if you can sustain it, it's great. If you can't, I do believe that the much predicted demise of a lot of smaller liberal arts colleges will happen, which, never having been associated with one, but having looked over the shoulder of many presidents of those, that's heartbreaking, because the good that they do, they're actually more democratic in many ways than public flagships. They educate a more diverse, poor student body than our public universities. And I'm not sure that that's another place where the labels do our thinking for us. Private liberal arts colleges sound like, Pendleton Woolens on a New England fall, and instead, these are growing often out of religious missions, out of philanthropic missions. We can't really afford to lose. I mean, the great strength of American higher education is its biodiversity. As we standardize and we lose the flexibility that comes from each institution being able to adapt itself in the way that different organisms do to these different situations. So I worry a lot about the monoculture that's emerging, and I worry about the retraction of public support, which has fed the cycle in which institutions have to take care of themselves, and so to do so, the tuition increases and the philanthropy increases and so forth. So what do I predict? I predict that too many people have too much at stake to let the system collapse, but I do believe you can see it erode. And you might actually think about this as global climate change. We're not going to wake up tomorrow and not be able to breathe, but we are finding that there's going to be a degradation of the environment over time. So I just made that up. It sounded plausible to me as I said it. So.
Well, it's not only plausible, but you can see your natural gifts as a writer and storyteller, and that you made a effortless bridge to my next question. It's just uncanny.
It is, isn't it?
Well, which is this is, I guess, the biggest question we've got, which is, how do you see these transformations in higher education? I mean, the move towards a monoculture, for example, the rich getting richer, the continued reduction of state support, and the previous dynamics we were talking about before. How do you see all these intersecting with the biggest trends, such as, for example, escalating income inequality and climate change?
We're simultaneously, we being higher education, our best chance, but we're also, if I may add another climatological metaphor, canaries in the coal mine. We are built to sense what's going on in the larger environment, right? And to be attuned to it. We feel things before anybody else does, right? And unfortunately, and to feel them more strongly. You know, so we were talking before about Black Lives Matter and all the issues of ethnic identity, also of gender identities. All those things, you know, that we're criticized for being, you know, snowflakes or politically correct and all that. What it really means is that we're paying attention to who people are. And we're seeing them when they're 18 or 19 and as they come into the world. So I think that what you'll see is that the institutions are going to prefigure what the rest of the society will be feeling 10 years from now. So I'm confident that students coming to college now are sensitized to the issues of climate in a way that no generation before has been. And I believe that having seen quite a few generations come through in my time, including my own, that these students seem to have a civic understanding that's greater than those that I've seen before, and a civic commitment that I think is going to play out in lots of powerful ways. You know, I once asked what kind of students we had at Richmond, and one young woman said, we have practical idealists, you know? And so everybody bemoans, oh, everybody's going to business school or whatever, you know, they're in STEM. But the fact is that people want tools to make a difference. And I think the job of those of us in the humanities is to show that the humanities are tools too, that they make a difference in the world and that they are critical. So if we don't run out of time, I'm full of confidence in the students that are coming to our institutions and what we are teaching them. And do I think we'll run out of time? I don't. You know, here's another kind of fact that I learned. People might have generally negative attitudes about higher education, but ask them if they like where they went.
It's like,
and they all say, I loved my college. They did a great job, right? And so, you know, that's been translated back into fundraising and development. And, you know, I've done quite a bit of that. And that was a big surprise to me when I went from being a faculty member to being a dean and with enormous development responsibilities, is that it's not sorted. It's actually the fuel that creates the possibility for new generations, right? And so it turned out that I could sell it. Maybe this is my used car salesman genes, but I found that I wasn't asking for money for myself. I was asking for some kid who's going to come to the university and benefit from it. And the amount of goodwill among our alumni, and that's what they care about. You know, we see them at the ball games and whatever, and it looks kind of faintly silly. But you talk to them individually, and something I often said, I discovered, if they're willing to talk to the dean about a gift, they're probably smarter and more philanthropic than I am. If they have that much money to give and are willing to talk to me, they know I'm going to ask them for money. So I think that's something that we tend to stigmatize is actually can be a remarkable resource that when we run into these kinds of challenges that we're going to face. So I think, and the admissions teams, you know, we've seen the admissions scandals, and those are easy to parody, but the people who do this for a living are generally, all that I've met, see themselves in the opportunity business, recruiting people who say, hey, you might not know about this, but here's this scholarship. So I think a lot of the things that we're actually criticized for, the machinery that we're criticized for, can actually end up helping us create more opportunity going forward.
I hope so. That's a very optimistic read. Thank you. I love the idea of higher education being an antenna for the future. Well, we'll bring back.
That's better than a canary, since antennas don't die. Canaries might.
That's right. That's right. And you're going forward rather than down. Our next question is one that is about revelation, and I wanted the way we phrased it. It was a certain way, but I think Kelly has a better way of asking it. So let me mention it, and then let me let Kelly take over here. The question we had was, what have these crises over the past year? What have they revealed about higher education? You know, stuff that maybe you or a few other people would know, but that most weren't talking about. But Kelly, go ahead. Yours is a much more eloquent question. I think you're muted.
Muted.
It's even more eloquent when I can hear you.
So the history nerd in me wanted to ask something kind of about, the historical perspective. And as an historian, what do you make of the responses in higher ed to Black Lives Matter, to COVID? And what role does higher education have in confronting or remaking history?
I think that if you look at what we've been teaching for a long time, so my field basically is the history of the South and of race. It's been, refining all our language so we're clear thinking about, we don't say slaves anymore, we talk about enslaved people. And that's a big difference, right? To actually think about where these things come from, who people are, how they fit into systems. But the challenge is translating that to a non-academic environment, right? The things that we would use as a precise kind of language, other people would see as jargon or as political correctness or as pretension. And instead, to be able to show it matters what we name things and what we name people, right? So I think that a lot of the hard work, the hard cultural work has been done for a long time in institutions of higher education and in students that are drawn to those classes. But even in our own institutions, there seem to be walls around how far that reconceptualization extends. And I won't name any names, but certain schools inside universities are famous for disdaining that kind of insight and actually, proclaiming that this is all just political correctness or it's liberalism or it's lefty or whatever. So trying to find language in which this kind of systematized sensitivity is one way to think about it, right? I tell people there's no such thing as political correctness. It's just called being alert to other people. All that really means is you're thinking about who they are and where they've come from. So I think that our job right now is mainly one of translation of the kinds of understanding that we've come to be able to, and you see how this happens all the time. I think of, The New Jim Crow is a book that sort of grows out of an academic setting, or, Ibram Kendi, anti-racism. All these things are nurtured in an environment of academia, but find ways to speak beyond. I think that's our biggest challenge. Institutions themselves seem to be, and it's painful to watch go through the same cycles every year of freshmen having to discover what seniors have already learned about culture and about, and I found that a lot of young people coming in think they can play with jokes about ethnicity and things the way they see people on television doing, and don't understand the damage that they do when they're talking in these ways. And so on one hand, they've grown up as they imagine it, sophisticated, but their own experiences hasn't really equipped them to know the power of the concepts and humor that they're playing with. So it's so frustrating to every year have to re-educate people. So I just told you this last year. Oh, you weren't here. I get it, right? And so we have these internal challenges. You also have the challenges of the naming of buildings and who's worthy of respect. And I think that's an entirely healthy thing to think about. We have many histories. Why are we reflecting only this one in the names of our buildings? And the very strength I just extolled about the possibility of private philanthropy can also become entangled in these names. And also living in the South, I've consulted with other universities who find they have, statues and flags and names that once seemed honorific and natural, and then seemed kind of culturally unique and identifiable, and now just seem oppressive. And, to watch these institutions, I never would have thought, having grown up on Southeastern Conference football, that they would have made the decisions. And I grew up on NASCAR, and to see those decisions. So which is not higher education, but Southeastern football is, right? That we're not going to play in places that have Confederate insignia and see the state of Mississippi change its state flag as a result. It gives you some idea of the cultural power that our institutions have that we sometimes don't recognize. Having come from a big state university, I know many people in the state identify with it who had no direct association with it. And sports, which is frequently derided, is a great cohesive force that can pull together different people. So I think a large part, I guess my theme in a lot of this is that we have strengths that are hidden from us, that have become so familiar, and that have even become known as weaknesses, that we can convert into strengths if we do it with a sense of purpose and self-awareness. How about that? Celebration of college football.
Kelly, I hope that's a good answer for you.
Great answer. Thank you.
Well, before we go down the road of NASCAR, see what I did there? I wanted to.
There's no road and no down. There's just left turns. You know.
Well, that's a metaphor that I'll have to come back to another time. I want to return to my previous metaphor and narrow our aperture a little bit. I want to focus on a couple of pieces of higher education and ask your thoughts about this. One of them is let's, for the sake of argument, call it the instructional design profession. That's partly professional instructional designers, but also academic technologists, educational computing people, and some in the library and IT fields who work closely with connecting technology and education. Just to lump them up together and call them instructional design. They played a heroic role in the spring of helping lead campuses online. And I'm wondering, what can that profession contribute to higher education moving forward as we respond to all these crises in the way that you're describing? What's the role of this instructional design profession? And keep in mind, we're asking this with a little interest in mind, because students like Kelly in the LDT program, that's one of their major career paths.
Well, I was already prepared to pander anyway, so, but I can because what I was going to say, and I'm still going to, is that I'm on record saying that the people that you just described are the heroes in the digital revolution that came before this crisis. That's how you and I know each other, Bryan. We've been kind of travelers in this effort. As I think of it, you know, in history, we were resistant to it for a very long time. And I would go to my professional meetings. I'm saying, surely we can find something to do with a global network of instantaneous information exchange. There's nothing that we can do in the entire record of the human past that would be interesting and worthy. And for a long time, the answer was no, not really. And we still write monographs and we still lecture. And so I've been trying for 30 years now to get us to embrace what the digital capacities around us are. I would say that we never really did, but corporate America kept giving us things like Zoom and you know, all the tools that we all use, Google Books and all those kinds of things. In some ways, there's been very little self-mobilization among humanists in particular, and even among those of us who were teachers. We have been resistant to all the opportunities that the matrix of people you just described, Bryan, have made to us. Until suddenly, and this is the way history always moves, seismically, until the plates shifted and we find that if we want to teach at all, we're going to use these media, right? And when we do, we find, hey, wait a minute, people have been working on this for a long time to make this a lot better than we realize. Now, I'd have to say that, you know, the distance between what I imagine digital humanities could be and Blackboard is a pretty wide gap, right? And so the commercial systems that are built to answer every kind of need for every kind of instructor, every kind of institution, not surprisingly, are generic and broad and hard to tailor. And so I've used it quite a bit for my teaching over the last 7 or 8 years. And I had to get used to how to learn it. Because compared to going to Kinko's and making 800 Xerox packets, which is what I did for the U.S. history class I taught for a long time, and getting copyright permissions and all that for everything, compared to embedding a link in Blackboard, it's enormously better. And of course, what else has happened is that the archive has expanded exponentially, again, through basically commerce, through EBSCO, and that I can put all these embedded links and things. So I think that what we're finding now is that it's unfortunate, but maybe necessary, that the first time faculty are really confronting digital teaching is as a matter of necessity, and it's done through the medium that we're talking through right now, which I greatly admire. It works remarkably. This is my third one today, and we've had dozens of people on the other one, public comment on an important public policy issue, and it works really well. But we haven't closed the gap at all between thinking, okay, we're teaching through digital means. We have all these digital tools. Could we fuse them so that they would actually not just be substitutes for analog? And I'm not finding that we are tapping the digital, as we say in the digital humanities biz, the affordances of the capacities of the digital. So I'm hoping that in this time of kind of fervent improvisation, that we'll still be thinking, what could we do to make tools that were better suited for all kinds of teaching, that are not just add-ons to this kind of basically analog presentation through a digital means. So I'd have to say, speaking from my own discipline, I found us to be remarkably resistant to amplified means of teaching and research. And now what you find is that even though people will be doing research digitally, we disguise it in our monographs as analog links, right? It's like, I don't really want to say I got this out of newspapers.com. Instead, this is the Scranton newspaper from December 14th, 1913. Right?
Page 4.
And so even the degree of integration we are making is hidden from ourselves. So all that's a way of saying, thank goodness we have all the people who are focusing on the capacities, the possibilities of these means. Maybe you'll have a more receptive set of collaborators than you had before. That's my perennially hopeful perspective.
It is. Thank you. That's I love that. I think it was Janet Murray who came up with the idea that whenever we invent a new technology, we kind of copy and paste old habits onto it. There's that first phase, and then there's that second phase where we figure, oh, this is a new thing. What can we do with it that's intrinsic to it, its own affordances? So we're maybe making that two-step process right now. But
yeah, and I love that book, Hamlet on the Holodeck. I've used it a lot, and we keep, and early television is basically just a vaudeville on a
right.
So we keep doing things that are basically a monograph on a screen, pictures of pages. We know we can do better than that, and it's almost like we had to burn through all the old models before we could sort of embrace the new ones. But, it's teaching students who've grown up reading probably 95% of the text they read on a screen. Maybe that's going to change what people's expectations are. I asked my undergraduates one time if they could tell me what a monograph was. And they looked puzzled and they said, one student said, does it have anything to do with monotonous? And I said, well,
Sometimes,
but that's not what we're talking about. But I said, who knows what a Bunsen burner is? And they all did. I said, well, the monographs are the way that humanists actually create new knowledge, and it being completely obscured to them. So maybe there'll be kind of a transparency of where new ideas come from about human experience, and we can start building the bridges back into earlier grades than we have before.
Oh, I hope so. That's a great metaphor. Well, let me let me press on that question of research a bit, and bring up the topic of science. And this is a question that's based on the huge cultural back and forth about science in general this year. We've had the waves of adoration for epidemiology. We've had the huge pushbacks, the politicization of it. So the question is, there's a lot of skepticism about the relevance of science, and both natural sciences as well as the social sciences, if we think of anti-racist activism under that header. And what does this rising skepticism tell us about how academics craft research messages, and how we persuade the population that these are important and should be heeded?
That's a good question. I think that people still love the final output of science. Mm-hmm. Give me that vaccine, right? And I have to admit, I have science envy as a humanist. As I read the Washington Post and the New York Times every day and see the latest discovery of archaeology or of astronomy, of cellular science, it's like, but we're discovering new stuff all the time too, but it's not seen as discovery, right? It's not labeled as such. Mm-hmm. So, and in many ways, I find that scientists are far ahead, well, in two different ways. On one hand, there's no such thing as digital science. In the way we have digital humanities, right? You don't have the implied contrast between the medium and the product. Yeah. And on the other hand, scientists are still swapping around, images of research reports. Social science, ironically, seems to integrate the two with data sets and explorable, ways you can manipulate the same data to see it in different kinds of ways. So I think that people are skeptical of anything that doesn't seem to have immediate consequence. So basic research, they're suspicious of, and we always laughed again about raising money. Look at any college catalog or any halftime representation of a college on a football game. What does science look like? It involves a white lab coat and goggles and a beaker full of colored liquid, right? It's what people, and why is that? That's because it's going to, with a Bunsen burner probably, it's going to turn into a product of some sort. Americans are just very practical people, and yet we have nurtured, partly as a result of the Cold War, this enormous enterprise of basic science research. I find when I was dean, I visited all 27 departments and on 2 or 3 days. I'd just go from one to the other. And I said it's like those M.C. Escher drawings where things are distorted. It was like everybody could find a way to look down on everybody else. So that discipline is too quantitative or it's not quantitative enough. It's too theoretical or it's not theoretical enough. It's too applied, it's not applied enough. Because we're basically irrational people who are committed with a passion to this thing that we're interested in, right? And a university is basically a giant complex in which people's irrational curiosity is tolerated from one office to the next, right? But we don't really understand what would drive somebody to be interested in dead people for a living, just to choose an example, right? Or a mushroom. Why would you be interested? But we all have a larger sense of the utility of what we're doing. And I study dead people because I think it's the only way to understand living people, right? And so I think that I really wish my fellow humanists would get over STEM resistance and resentment. Everybody is doing the best they can. So when I was dean in charge of all promotion and tenure cases and read all the different files, my takeaway after 8 years of doing that is that what everybody does is hard. I can remember the scientists saying, coming in, a humanist, you write a book, and then they come to realize, do you have to know to write a book about medieval French literature? And they go, oh, okay, I get it. That's really hard. And humanists figure out, writing a 3-page research report with 27 different authors in which you have to raise the money, is also really hard. And so everybody needs to develop greater respect for each other. We think about the canary in the coal mine or the antenna or whatever. I think universities are places that are built on tolerance and built on acceptance, despite our own tribal impulses, right? The institution is built, we have to collaborate whether we want to or not. So just as American higher education is about biodiversity, so are our institutions. So in the same way that we respect each other's irrational passions, I think we need to be able to be allies to scientists in the outside world in helping to explain why basic research is necessary. The last thing we want to do is be turning on each other because of the particular passion that we have.
Well, it's because a university is a giant complex where people's irrational obsessions are tolerated. I love that. That's better than, that's an upgrade to, what's his name's, the Cliff, University of California fellow, the universities, faculty who are united only
unified by parking grievance.
That's right. That's right.
Yes.
I like yours better. Thank you. Well, we have one last question to put to you, and then I think one more open-ended one.
Okay.
And this is another detail question, kind of detailed question. One of the things revealed by the Great Migration online in the spring of 2020 is the huge importance of the digital divide, the unequal distribution of networks and hardware across the United States. What do you think of the role of this divide now? I mean, is this something that is shaping how we move online? Is this something how it shapes how we address racial inequities? What's higher education's role in responding to it?
I'd say first that this crisis has done us a favor in calling attention to that long-term disaster of the digital divide, to calling our attention that we cannot tolerate it. We simply cannot teach in this world if we sustain it. And so you're seeing a lot of efforts, a lot of different governments and nonprofits to create network capacity, even if it's roaming hotspots and things like that. So, I work with a board that addresses some of these issues, and you see that schools will often have universal Chromebook distribution, right? But not when the kids go home, they don't have universal access, right? So Americans love a technological fix. I don't worry as much about that because I think that is something that can be fixed with enough attention and money. We have the technology to do it, right? So, but it is really real. If I could segue a little bit into what I'm doing and how it relates to this, I will tell you. So, because I worry so much about the state of history education, we teach less history than we've ever taught before. It's the standardized tests are falling away from it. They're terrible when you do have them, but if you don't have it, the teachers don't teach it. So I realized, what do I care about the most? And it is to, somehow we've made everything that happened before today boring. I mean, the history education has been basically, and I don't know how many times I've seen people on an airplane who see me reading a book of footnotes or grading a paper and say, "Oh, you're a teacher?" I said, "Yeah." "Well, you teach history?" I always hated history, all those names and dates, right?
Yeah, same complaint.
But we know that it's everything that happened before today. How can that be boring?
Right.
And so I actually believe that these new digital technologies are our best chance to change that. So I've created something called newamericanhistory.org that has 3 different components. One of the components is a digital atlas of American history, American Panorama, in which you can see things like the foreign-born population in every county of the United States identified by ethnicity from 1850 to the present move. You can watch the forced migration of slavery. You can see our most popular maps have been mapping inequality, mapping redlining in every city in the United States, and then mapping urban renewal. And so you have a distributed model in which every person can see themselves in American history, but they're vast. The other part of it is called Bunk, which is a play on Henry Ford's quote that history is more or less bunk. It says the only history that matters a damn is the history you make today. Bunk is a real-time curation of every representation of the American past in all media every day, all of which is tagged so it relates to everything else, bunkhistory.org. And so what you see, and this kind of goes back to your question and to Kelly's question about how do we get this word out, people are doing this work of translation in all kinds of journalistic media, blogs, podcasts, everything's every day, but we can't see it anywhere. We think history is that thing in the classroom, right? Mm-hmm. Instead, this is meant to capture ambient history or free range history that's out there. The other thing, Bryan was kind enough to mention before, that a podcast that I've worked on for 12 years, Backstory, that's integrated. So what we're doing is trying to take these, and the PBS series that I'm hosting called The Future of America's Past, in which we go to the front lines of places where people are interpreting the past, like Chicago 1919, the great massacre there about race. So if you want to understand Black Lives Matter, let's go back 100 years before. We also made a thing about the 1918 pandemic and the flu. How did people deal with that? So applied history. All of New American history then is designed that you can see on your phone, but you can also look at it on a big screen and see remarkable things. And it's all flexible. It trusts teachers to do the best that they can, but to give them resources that if you have 5 minutes to talk about immigration today, let's see where people from Mexico, when did they first start coming to the United States? Wow, a long time ago. And look how long they've been here and so forth. You can do that. Or you can say, hey, I want everybody to go out and find the 3 best articles about the history of Black Lives Matter. You go to Bunk, you do a search, it relates all those together, and you can see them. So what I would say to both of you, I'm trying to use the affordances of the digital world to give it away with no overhead of any kind of system or of cost. And then we've made learning resources. A professional teacher is showing how, if you have to teach about Black Lives Matter, how you might weave together these different kinds of sources. Some kids would think well with a podcast. Some kids would think well with a map that's moving. Other kids would think well with a really interesting article or a graphic novel, right? So in all those different kinds of ways, we're trying to use the different valences of the digital media. And all those things are harvesting things that already exist. So all those maps are made out of pre-existing data that the United States government has gathered, right? That we then see every election in American history to the present, down to the granularity of an election night podcast, but you can see about the 1896 election, right? So all those, and then Bunk is that 500 publications are harvested there in 5,000 articles. Well, we don't have to write them all, aggregating them. So I think those of you in your program can see how this all works. And then the tagging is done by undergraduates that we train and then pay at Richmond to do this. And the goal is to make something that looks good enough to be expensive, but it's free. And we're giving it to middle school, high school, community college, and higher education. So we're working with different organizations to get the word out. So that's what I'm trying to do to overcome the digital divide, that if you only have a cell phone, Bunk is designed to work on a cell phone. The maps work less well, but a podcast works great on it. And that if you go to Bunk, you can choose 3 articles and it builds a collection that is then sent to your teacher. And then the next day you go into class and she's able to say, hey, here are the 5 articles that people found most interesting. Let's talk about those. So that you're able to have out-of-class work that can be done on a school bus, on a phone, that's then imported into a system that can be shared. So I'm trying to bring together experience running in higher education institutions with what I got into all this about in the first place is democratizing American history in its subject, and now try to democratize it in its teaching. It's being taught great at very expensive schools or schools that have 5 AP classes, but where I'm from, there are no AP classes. But wouldn't it be great if teachers had access to the same cool resources as people at rich schools? So you can see how this addresses And as I've said, I'll end with this. My dream is that every 7th grade girl in America can see herself in American history.
Mm.
That's what we're trying to do.
Well, that's a very subversive and radical vision, and it's a beautiful one. I just signed up for bunk mail because I had to.
And even that's funny, isn't it?
It
Bunk mail.
We've gone over a little over an hour, and we've covered a huge range of territory. I wanted to say thank you. This is tremendous. It's just been a delight to benefit from your thinking and your extraordinary experience and your sense of humor and also your passion, both for history in particular and for higher education in general. Thank you very much.
Well, you're very kind and generous, and appreciate this opportunity. And you folks are doing good work. I'm counting on you to figure this stuff out. So I wish you well with it, and look forward to talking with you again.